welcome to another HeliDirect Hack TV build series video. This video is going to be on the XL Power Nimbus 550 helicopter. It is a fantastic first kit build if you've never built a helicopter before. It's also a great entry-level helicopter to really be your first sort of larger size helicopter that you build yourself. And can really lead you to progress down the road towards a larger 600 and 700 size radio control helicopter. So what's this video aimed at, right? So if you're a raw beginner, you've never taken on a kit build before, XL Power manuals are really, meant for slightly more experienced helicopter builders, right? So this video is meant to bridge that gap, right? It's a fantastic beginner's helicopter. If the manual is just a little bit, it would be even better. So my hope is that if you build your helicopter along with this video series, you'll pick up a few hints and tips along the way. You'll learn some things that maybe aren't called out in the manual. You'll pick up some extra products, some greases, some oil, some lubricants, thread lockers, all kinds of, tips and hints and suggestions along the way to really help you out. Now the other part of this is I wanted to do this as a budget build. Now some of my helicopters have, top of the line servos from Theta and, Ego Drift's largest and most powerful motor, and an ESC with perhaps fancier features and telemetry than others. There's a million different options in the electronics side of the hobby, but I specifically chose the components in this helicopter to be more budget friendly. Now, it's not an inexpensive hobby, so I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that this is going to be a cheap bargain basement helicopter. It's not. The helicopter kit comes at a very reasonable price, as do all of the electronics I've chosen. What I am going to say is that these electronics are a little more wallet friendly. They're a little more on the budget side. And if you watch out along major US holidays, you can often catch a great deal at HeliDirect when we have our sales. So keep an eye on the sales, subscribe to the newsletter, emails, etc. And you can even save a little more. So we're going to see some budget, and not cheap, but some budget friendly motors from Ego Drift. We've got a budget friendly ESC from Hobbywing planned. And we're going to use Theta's THM 988. We'll talk about that more later. Servo, it doesn't have the sort of fancy NFC programming capabilities of the Sabre C1 microserver, which cost more money. So again, we've made some choices like that in order to help this be a little more affordable to some. So without that, let's get into the kit and start digging in. So I'm going to cover some basics here and there. And I'll talk about them a little bit, but I'm not going to talk about them every single time. And one example of that is cleaning your screws and bolts. So XL Power in their manuals and in their kits provides some sub-assemblies that are temporarily assembled in the factory. Now what this means as, for example, this is the Swashplate and all of the balls have been installed here, but they're not thread locked. So we need to remove all of these balls, put thread locker on them, and then reinsert them in the swash plate. So we're going to go through all of the parts in the manual where you need to disassemble something. Sometimes the manual says you need to disassemble it, but you don't. It's really been pre-installed by the factory, so I'll cover all of that as we go. But this episode is mainly going to focus on the swash plate and head of the helicopter, the main rotor head. We're going to get all of that built and assembled and go through it step by step by step. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about cleaning bolts. So every single bolt in a helicopter, and I'm going to cut to the overhead camera here, as it's machined and created, and cut to size in the factory and whatnot, has a machining oil that's on the threads of the bolt that is just, left over from the manufacturing process. That process makes the thread lockers we use, and we'll talk about those in a minute, less effective. So in order to clean that residue off and make sure that the bolt isn't going to vibrate out as the helicopter's flying around and whatnot, there's a lot of vibration in a helicopter, a lot of spinning parts, obviously. We use these thread lockers to hold these screws in place and they don't back out. But the oil used on these screws in the manufacturing process will counter that thread locker and make it not work. So here's how I go about cleaning my screws and bolts. So what I'll do is I use acetone. This is commonly available at any home improvement store or paint store. If you prefer something a little less, toxic, acetone does come with its warnings. You can use alcohol with a very low water content. So you want something that's like 99% pure, an alcohol solution, and that will clean your bolts as well. So what I do, I take some paper towel, I fold it up, and I simply pour some acetone on it, and then I'll take my bolt, and I get a driver, and I get the right size driver, and what I do from there is I take the paper towel, I put the bolt in the wet spot, fold it over, and I'll go once, and then I'll spin in another orientation and go twice until it's clean. Now, I've already gone ahead and cleaned all of these bolts, but this is the residue that'll be left behind on the paper towel. And as you can see, it's very black and oily on here. So that black oily stuff that you just saw on the paper towel is what will stop the thread locker from working. So on every single step in this helicopter, you should assume that I've removed every single bolt and screw, and I've cleaned them all with acetone. I'm not going to show you that because that would make for a horrendously boring video, but it's a tedious and time-consuming part of the build, but it's extremely important. This particular bolt that we just cleaned is what holds the main rotor hub, so your main rotor disc on the helicopter. It's what holds it to the top of the main shaft that it revolves around, right? That bolt backs out, the entire head of the helicopter comes off. You have a spinning, basically circular saw blade, but bigger, going off in one direction, and your very expensive helicopter falling to the ground to break in another direction. So obviously thread lockers are very important. We're going to use a few different colors of thread lock in our build. We'll use blue thread lock. This is the most common form we use in helicopter builds. It is easily removable. So even though it's sort of a glue that holds the screw in, just a little bit of gentle pressure, you hear a little bit of a crack sound, and it'll pop, and it'll come on out. We're going to use green Loctite or retaining compound. We use this to hold bearings in place. We don't need very much. We'll use just a very sparing amount of this, and there's a few spots where we may use some green Loctite to hold a bearing in place. And then red Loctite is used for, it's a little more sort of a permanent or semi-permanent type of Loctite. We use this in sort of mission critical applications. So there's one screw doing a very important job and I don't want it to come out. So for example, there's a little tiny set screw that holds the pinion to your motor shaft, and that's what drives the whole helicopter, provides it power. It's also obviously an area of high vibration. So I don't want that little tiny set screw backing out, so I'm going to put red Loctite on that. Can you remove it later? Yes, if you apply heat via, say, a heat gun or maybe the tip of a soldering iron. It depends on where you're trying to get to. So use red Loctite sparingly, because it does make it much harder to remove. Not impossible, but harder to remove that particular bolt. All right, enough about thread lock. How about we go ahead and get started with the build? Now, the manual in the XL Power for the XL Power Nimbus is not necessarily in the order that I would choose to build a helicopter. And once you get a few kit builds under your belt, you have kind of free license to move things around, right? You might decide to build this part of the helicopter before the other, or even like today's episode, in a particular part of the helicopter, meaning the main rotor head, I'm going to build it in a different order than it is in the manual. So let's go ahead and take a look at that manual, right? So the first page of the manual has you taking one of the blade grips and inserting the bearings in it. And then the second page has you putting these blade grip arms onto the blade grip. And then the third page has us starting with the main rotor hub and getting the dampeners installed. So we're going to go in a slightly different order. We're going to come back to the second page and we're going to work on simply inserting our blade grip arms, that's this piece here, into our blade grips here, and then also inserting this ball that our main drive links will attach to into the blade grip arm. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and dive into that step. So coming to the overhead camera here. So this is our blade grip arm here, and these are our blade grips, and it's a simple matter of attaching this here with 2 screws, and then also attaching this ball into the blade grip arm. Now, in this blade grip arm, there are 2 separate holes. Now, the blade grip arm is going to go in this orientation, like so. Let me see if I can get it in the palm of my hand so you can see it a little better. There we go. Now, the hole closest to the outside is where most beginners are going to want to go. Honestly, it's where most people who fly this helicopter are probably going to put the ball. The inner hole here does make the helicopter much more agile. That's definitely for more advanced pilots who want maybe a faster roll rate. They want a lot more agility. They want it to be snappier and faster near center. Obviously, if you're a beginner, that's the last thing you want. So I'm going to go ahead and put the ball in the outside hole. Now, in some situations, and this is one of them, the way that the manufacturer will provide parts here is that when you purchase a new blade grip arm, this piece here, and this is a sacrificial piece, it's meant to bend in the event of a crash, you'll get a new one of these balls. So in this case, there's no reason not to use red Loctite. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little red Loctite. So I use the plastic bags that come with the kit, and I just keep one aside, and I just put a little drop of red Loctite there. And I'll use the same process no matter what type of Loctite I'm using. I always keep paper towel handy when I'm doing a build. And what I'll do here is I just dip the tip of the threads in that red Loctite. Now, I don't want that much red Loctite. I will never be able to get that off with that much. So what I do is I use my finger to push that Loctite into the threads here, right? So now, I've only got a little bit on here. I've wiped the rest of it off on my paper towel. And I'm going to take this with the red Loctite on it and screw it into the outer hole of the blade grip arm. Now, don't go crazy with force in these situations. There's no need, all right? A lot of the parts of a helicopter are made of some soft aluminum, and if you go crazy with torquing these bolts in, you will do damage to them. So, again, same thing, pushing the Loctite into the threads. We're going to go ahead and do the opposite blade grip arm as well while we're at it. In any of these situations where there's more than one part of the helicopter, they're symmetrical parts, I tend to do them both at the same time. I also like to take my paper towel and just wipe out any excess Loctite that may have squeezed out as I was tightening things on. It doesn't usually affect the helicopter performance at all, but it just looks nicer. You don't have little blobs of Loctite everywhere. All right, so we've now got our two blade grip arms with our balls on. We're going to go ahead and screw them into our blade grips. Now, in this situation, there are two screws here that go into the blade grip arm. You can see them here in the manual over here. So, whenever there's more than one screw doing a task, it's not mission critical, there's no need for red Loctite. Also, this is a sacrificial part that in the event of a crash you want to be able to easily replace. So we're going to use blue Loctite. So over here on my bag I have another little dollop of blue, and we're going to go ahead and take these bolts here. And these were pre-threaded into the blade grip arm. I unscrewed these earlier. And as part of my preparation for this step. So, if you look at the blade grip, there's a little bit of a raised area that this just sort of snaps right over. And anytime in a helicopter build where we have one of these deals where there is more than one screw, I'm just trying to get this kind of fitted over that raised area, there it goes. What I do is I just loosely start one of the screws, and then I go ahead and start the other screw, and I won't tighten them until I have both in alignment. And I do that because, well, if you've ever put IKEA furniture together, you know, right? If you start tightening one screw down too soon, it can throw the whole thing out of alignment. And now that I have this in, I'm going to gently send that first one home, and then tighten the second one down as well. Don't go crazy with tightness here, but obviously you want to make sure this is correct because this is how your whole helicopter is controlled. So there's one done. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. And you can see all these washers and all these things laid out in here. We're going to talk about that in just a minute when we get into our other steps. It'll all make sense. But I've unpacked basically everything that was in bag one, which is all about the main rotor head and our swash plate, and laid it out here, just so you don't have to watch me open a million plastic bags. Alright, this is all aligned. I'm going to start driving this in. Again, don't go crazy tightening this, just soft aluminum here. Alright, we now have our blade gripped arms into our blade grips. Okay, now the next step I'm going to go to is to go to page 3 here of the manual, and I'm going to work on the main hub. Specifically, I want to do the dampeners next. Now, the head dampeners are in the main head block. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what they do, but loosely what they provide is they dampen the rotor head, right? If it was a rigid system, there would be no give, transitioning between, hovering and movement, the whole way that the feathering shaft works and the way the blade grips rotate around and all of these things, the dampening helps, stabilize and reduce vibration to some extent. But anyway, enough about that. All right, so in this upper left-hand corner, They talk about what's included in the kit, which are these 3 sort of rubber O-rings and a very special washer. And then they talk about the optional, what's called a palm dampener, or a hard plastic type dampening solution, which is a little different. But what we have in the kit is what I'm going to use. It's these 3 rings on the left. What we're going to do is we're going to cover them all in grease, and we're going to insert them into the main hub. And then we're going to get our feathering shaft involved as well. So with that, let's come back to our overhead here, and I'll show you what these pieces are. Now, this is the main hub right here, and when I opened the bag, it has these radius arms pre-installed on it. So I've gone ahead and removed these 2 bolts here, which have these 2 tiny washers each. Pay attention to where those washers are when you remove it, and also don't lose them. They're tiny. If they hit the carpet, you will never see them again. So I've got these just tucked out of the way so that our main hub can kind of lay flat. It's a little easier to work with. This bolt right here, we jokingly call this the Jesus bolt. It's what will attach once your main shaft inserts in the base of this hub. It's the bolt that will go through that main shaft and secure the hub to the top of the shaft. But I've gone ahead and removed it and cleaned it just while I had it handy. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just reinsert it just so I don't lose it. I'm not really going to tighten it down very much, but we're just going to sort of tuck it away in there. So do be sure, remove that Jesus bolt, give it a good clean. So now, these dampeners are going to go on the feathering shaft. Now this feathering shaft, when it comes in the package, has these bolts and washers on them that will go in the end of them once we have the main head built. So I've gone ahead and removed those from each side and tucked them off to each side. And I've got the main, bare feathering shaft here. So this next step, what we want to do is insert these 3 rubber type dampeners in the head while covering them in grease. Now, as far as which grease goes, this is Tri-Flow clear thin synthetic grease. What's most important here is that you use a clear synthetic grease, not so much the brand, but Tri-Flow is readily available in many places. And then the fun part here, and we're going to talk about this, is that the end of the feathering shaft is threaded. It's where those bolts I just showed you will go. We want to not get grease in there as much as possible. So the way I like to do this is I'll take the feathering shaft and I'll kind of slide it into the main hub. And I'll put these 3 rings over it first. And these are just dry. There's no lubrication on here yet. And then I'll pull them all the way back sort of towards the end of the ring. You can actually kind of pull it out for now. And then I'll grab my grease. And I tend to keep the grease sort of handy, and I put pressure on it with one hand. And then you just put some on the fingertip of the one I'm going to use. And I'm going to kind of grease these now. And you can put a little grease on the shaft that they'll go past here with my finger, and then get some kind of all around the outside of each one. And you see what I've avoided now is getting any grease in the end here of this shaft. Now, as well as that, I'm going to take the main hub here, and I'm going to, that's a little too much, I'm going to wipe some of that off here, and I'm going to just run my tip around on the inside, get a little bit of grease inside the hub as well. Do the same thing on the other side. We want these dampeners to move around in here freely. But we don't want a ton of extra grease in here, it's just going to spin out. But alright, and then just put a little more on here. Alright, so now what I'm going to do, wipe my finger off, and again, I'm going to keep putting fresh paper towel. In fact, I'm going to grab some now here for this greasy step. And again, I still have no grease on this end here. I'm going to slide this now into our blade grip, or sorry, our main hub here. Alright, so those popped in really easily. Sometimes they are not quite so easy. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So now, without getting any grease in the end, I'm just going to stack these on top here. And then I'm going to get some grease on my finger. We'll put some on the shaft so that the inside of the thrust bearing will pick up some grease as it gets squished by. Space these out a little bit, like so. And then we'll go here. So, This is, by the way, a silicone build mat, and I only use it for the steps that use grease. So usually when I'm building the tail rotor and the main rotor. And it's just nice to not worry about getting grease all over your, this is a nicer build mat underneath all of this here. And I'm just going to run these all around, get these nice and greased up, and then push them in all the way in. And then the next thing I want to do, and you don't have to be too particular about this, is I want to get the amount of feathering shaft sticking out each side of this hub roughly equivalent. So in this case, I've got too much on this side. I'm just going to kind of slide it down a little and give our O-rings a nice push into the hub as best as possible here on both sides. Great. And then I'm going to take a paper towel and just kind of, because my fingers have been all greasy, I'm just going to kind of wipe the excess grease off of the main block a little bit. And we'll clean this more later. It's going to get a little greasier still, and then we're going to lay it back there. So I always build my main rotor heads the same way. I put my blade grip arms on first, then I do my main hub, and now we're going to work on the blade grips and all of the washers that go inside that. Okay, so we've got our main hub done here, and we're going to go all the way back now to page 1 of the manual, and we're going to work on this blade grip here. Now, this is one of those instances in the manual where they talk about doing something. So here, they mentioned putting Loctite on the outside of this bearing. If we were to do this, it would be green Loctite or a rotating compound that holds the bearing into the blade grip. However, this has already been done at the factory. If you try and remove this bearing to do this, you will not be able to. So in my case, this was pre-done at the factory for this bearing. However, this bearing here pops right out. It doesn't need any retaining compound, but just FYI, this bearing travels loose in the blade grip, and then these washers all come in the bag here. Now, this stack of 3 washers here, here, and here are what make up what is called a thrust bearing. It's made up in 3 parts. I'm going to show how it works in just a second. But you can see here it says larger ID towards hub. What that means is larger inside diameter towards the hub, or the center of the helicopter. The main hub is the piece we just installed the dampeners in. And again, I'll go over this in a second. And then you want what we call the cup washer in the middle, and then the smaller inside diameter thrust washer on the outside. So what does that actually mean in practice? So when we come over to our stack of thrust bearings, we've got our smaller inside diameter on the outside, our cup washer, or larger inside diameter, and then the regular washer, and then the radial bearing that'll go in the head. Now, how do you know which is the smaller inside diameter and the larger inside diameter? Well, let me show you. So you just take your feathering shaft, and this is the smaller inside diameter, and I'm going to wiggle it, and I want you to watch how much it wiggles. So just a little bit, not much. If we take our larger inside diameter and slide it on here and wiggle it, do you see how much more that wiggles? That's how you can tell the hole on the inside is much larger. So what I like to do when I build my heads is get everything laid out in order the way it'll go. This line here is what will go inside the blade grip. So it goes smaller. Now I'm going to work from the outside in. Okay? So this bolt and washer go all the way on the outside and go into the end of this feathering shaft. Inside the blade grip is the, from outside in towards the center here, right, this is our center, is smaller inside diameter, cup washer, larger inside diameter, regular washer, radial bearing. All right, and this is how I put this together. I take a driver, that's an extra one, and we're going to put our thrust bearing together, and I work from the outside of the blade grip in such that I can slide all these washers into the blade grip like so. Thrust bearings need a lot of grease. So the way that we do this is we get some grease on our finger, and this particular thrust bearing has a groove you can see here, and that's going to run towards the cup bearing. The flat side of the thrust washer goes towards the outside. So I take this bearing and its grease, and I'm just going to slide it onto here, and now This is the cup bearing. There is one side that you can see has kind of a cavity with the balls in it, and the other side, it's like the balls sort of stick through the washer onto the other side. Now, there are some folks that say that the cup side, or the sort of cavity side, needs to face towards the outside of the rotor, and there are some that say it should face towards the inside. The most important thing is that what you do in one blade grip, you do in the opposite blade grip. My personal preference is to face the cup towards the outside. But before we place it in our stack, we want to fill this cup with grease. And here's where you don't want to be shy with the grease. Get plenty in there. Make sure you filled all that recess. It's going to get all over your fingers, no big deal. And then take that cup side and face it towards, in my case, the outside. Now, I've got our larger inside diameter thrust washer here now, and I'm going to fill that groove with grease, and then I'm going to slide it on here. So I'm going to take this off so I can show you how this works. And what they do is they form a bearing that easily rotates, right? This will rotate around the shaft. So put that right back in the order I had it in. Now, don't need to worry about greasing the washer. You certainly don't want to grease the radial bearing, although getting a little grease on it is no big deal as long as it's not inside the bearing there. All right, so now we've got that all stacked up just like it is in the manual. We've already got the one radial bearing in the base here that's pre-installed and is not coming out. So we're going to take this stack and we're going to slide it into the blade grip. And it's a little fussy to get this lined up, and you just got to sort of play with it. And everything's greasy, and your fingers are slippery, and it's a little fussy. But this is why we do it on a driver, because now that I have it aligned, I can just push it all the way into the blade grip and then remove the driver. So I've got my whole stack here, washers. I'm just going to use my finger to kind of push that home. And then I can use sort of the flat part to gently push that all the way in. Okay, so now this blade grip has all of its washers in, and I'm just going to gently lay it right there. We're going to do the same exact thing on the other side in the same order, working from outside the blade grip towards the inside of the blade grip. So we're going to move this driver we stack our greasy washers on over here, and we're going to do the same thing working from outside to inside. So we start with our smaller inside diameter thrust washer, and then put that there, and then we take our cup washer and we fill this cavity with grease. Just gobbing in there. Way too much grease on my fingers right now, but that's okay. I like to run the cup side towards the outside, so I'll go ahead and do that there. I take my larger inside diameter thrust washer and fill that groove with grease nicely, and then run the groove towards the cup washer, and then I slide my washer on, and then our radial bearing on. All right, I'm going to wipe my hands off here, get some of that excess grease off. But this is kind of a messy step. All right, I'm going to take this whole assembly and slide it into our other blade grip. Again, radial bearing already captured in there, with some kind of retaining compound on it already. And we're just gonna, try and get this stacked. Now there's kind of a curved recess inside the blade grip here. I'll show you in a second. And this whole stack of washers will just travel down that. I'm just gonna kind of push it into place gently with the driver. You definitely don't want to scratch up any part of the inside of this, so you can see the groove kind of in here that these washers all slide down. Now, we are close to having our main rotor head put together. So, next step to do from here is just double check these threads. Make sure that you didn't get any grease on them. And if you did, you're going to want to take some paper towel, put it on the end of it, your smallest driver, and swab it around in there. Take a Q-tip with some alcohol on it, clean it out. Get that grease out of there. You definitely do not want that coming into contact there. All right, so let's go back and look at the manual for a second. Come back to page 3, I believe it is here, and one more. Now, this shows, and I always wish that there would be like a blow-up diagram of the whole width, kind of like I had everything laid out in a manual, but it's not here. So the blade grip now has all its washers inside. We've got this special washer to insert between the blade grip and the main hub. And we've got this washer and screw to go into the end of our feathering spindle. So let's go ahead and get that step done next. And first thing we're going to do is take our special washers here, and these have sort of a narrow side and a wider side. And the little narrow side goes in towards the main hub. So you take that, slide this one on this side. We're going to take this one here, same thing, except now we're going to run the narrow side in towards the main hub and push those into place like so. Great, we've got those on. Now I'm going to take the blade grip from this side, it doesn't really matter which side, and slide it onto the feathering shaft. And then I'm going to take our screw here, and we're going to get some blue Loctite on. Again, in the event of a crash, the feathering spindle is one of those parts that often has to be replaced, so don't go crazy with too much blue Loctite or red Loctite here. I'm just pushing this into the threads and then wiping it off. Don't forget to add the little washer. Comes with this, and then this is going to go, if you look down into here, you can see the threads of our feathering spindle. And we're going to screw this bolt into it. Now, you can't tighten this down right now because tightening it is just going to cause this end of the shaft to spin. So really all we're doing is trying to make the threads make contact, and then we're going to call that good, and then we're going to go ahead and grab the other side. So same thing, we've already gotten our special washer on this side, and then we're going to take our other end here and insert it there, and then same deal here, we'll get our feathering spindle bolt, get some blue Loctite on that, really work it into the threads, get rid of the excess Loctite, add the washer, and then we're going to take this and go into the end of the feathering shaft. Okay, so now same thing here. If I turn this right here, it's not going to work, right? It's just going to start turning the other side. So what I need to do is go get another 3 millimeter driver, and then we're going to counter tighten them against each other. So let me grab one of those, and then I'll show you how that works. Okay, so now we've got our main head block here, and we need to tighten both bolts against each other. So I've got one 3 millimeter driver here that I'm going to hold in place in one side, and another 3 millimeter drive here I'm going to place on the other side. And what I need to do is counter tighten these against each other. And it's going to take a fair amount of tightening here. So now, one of the things you may have to do is spend some time and get the grease off your hands and maybe the drivers, because your hands get slippery. You need to get these kind of nice and tight. But one side of this is a scorpion driver, and one of the things I like about these is they have a hole in them that you can run another driver through. So this just gives me a little bit more torque on one hand. I'm going to put this in my right hand, take this side over here, and then I've got my two here, and then I'm just going to go nice and tight against each other here. You don't have to go crazy, but you want a decent amount. And what we're doing is we're compressing all those dampeners in the center to an extent. All right, let's see how we did. So, one of the things you should notice is that these blade grips should move not freely, they should move smoothly, right? If you feel like, we call it notchiness is the word we use, like you don't want to feel any of that. Like this movement should feel extremely smooth. Things be important. The important thing is that when you set these, they shouldn't fall into their own weight, right? Like this, if this goes flop, it's too loose and something's wrong, right? But is it smooth? Does it stay where I leave it? Yes. Same thing here. Is it smooth? Does it stay where I leave it? Yes. In which case, it's good to go. One of the the good things to do at this point is to maybe take a rag, take some degreaser like Simple Green or something, gently just on paper towel, and then clean all the excess grease. You've got your fingerprints all over it. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll be right back. Okay, we've gotten our head completely degreased at this point. Everything's moving nice and smooth. No notchiness at all. So that's good to go. I'm just going to temporarily set this aside. And then if we go to the next page in the manual, this is our swash plate we're seeing for the first time. Now, most of the swash plate is pre-assembled at the factory. However, all of these servo balls, which are these silver balls, I'll show you in just a second here, all need to be Loctited into the swash plate. These are just temporarily put in place. So these little servo balls on the outside of the swash plate all need to be Loctited. Now, in my case, again, if you order a new wash plate, it's going to come with all of these. So I use red Loctite here. I also don't want any of these backing out. Again, this swash plate is how commands are transferred from our servo to the main rotor head and to the main drive link. So we're going to go ahead and use red Loctite here. I'll show you a few of these screws going in, and then I'll go ahead and finish up without you here. So the important part about the swash plate here is that there's a few of these screws that need to go in the exact spot. So rather than remove all of them, I remove them in a couple different groups. So the first thing I do is I take out the anti-rotation pin, which is what we call, this is what holds the swash plate from spinning with the rest of the main rotor shaft. And take this guy out and go ahead and get some red Loctite on him. And then, whoops, way too much ended up on there. That's all right, we're going to wipe it off in a second. So we'll pull it out of the threads, paper towel, and pop it in. And again here, snug it up, give it a little extra, and that's about all it takes. Don't go crazy here. And then we'll do the outer ring of servo balls next. So same thing, red Loctite. There. And it's important that you work in a very purposeful way, and what I mean by that is, come up with a system in your mind to make sure that you don't miss one of these, right? Getting all of them and having one back out because you went too fast and weren't paying attention is just pointless, right? So now at this point, I'll stop and I'll make sure I wipe off any extra Loctite that kind of came out here in any of these spots. Neatness counts even on the inside of your helicopter. All right, so here, these two servo balls opposite each other that sort of go into these flat spots are different than the balls that go here and here into these sort of offshoots from the top of our swash plate here that kind of come out, and then they go in at a 90 degree. So I'm going to do these two together next, and then I'll come and do these two. If you put these in the wrong places, your links will pop off. How do I know? Because the XL Power 550 was my first kit build, and I wasn't paying attention to those in the wrong order, and one did pop off, fortunately just on the bench. So, do be careful there. Let's go around and do the other one. And I'm sure there are some folks saying, if you're more meticulous, there wouldn't be any extra Loctite. Well, I'd rather have a tiny bit too much, not a lot too much, but a tiny bit too much, and have to clean it up than not have enough. So if you look closely here, you can see that this style of ball is a little bit different than the other style. Get some red in the threads there. It's amazing how little red is still very much effective. These guys will strip really easily if you're not careful. Now in the case of this one, I was starting to feel like it was going in cross-thread. If you feel any resistance here, stop, check your angle and the way things are going, and then keep going. Don't force things in a helicopter build. If you get kind of manhandly with these bolts, things just start bending and stripping, and you end up having to order new parts, and you'll set your build back by, well, number one, you hope they're in stock, assuming they are. You're adding a week to your build while you wait for parts. So have lots of patience as you go through. All right, so now our swash plate is now done. We've got all of our balls in here, and we're not going to need this for a very long time. So I'm going to go ahead and take one of our bags from build, and I'll just go ahead and slide this in here. Just keep it dust-free and tuck it out of the way until we get to that part of the build where I need it back. Okay, so next step here is going to be to add our radius arms back onto the main head. Now we're not going to tighten them all the way, and I'll talk about why in just a second, but we're going to go ahead and attach them. Why do I do that? Because I don't like all of these little parts kind of hanging out. I don't like to put them back in bags. I like to, keep sub-assemblies kind of together. So let's take a look at the manual again. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead a page again to the radius arms, and you can see here in the bottom left that they've pre-assembled these. So if you look up here, all of this stuff about, putting retaining compound on this bearing, and these spacers in the middle, and this bearing, and putting this pin in across here, across our radius arm, this whole thing is done. This is a sub-assembly here. So really all we have to focus about is cleaning this bolt, running it through these 2 washers, putting blue Loctite on it, and driving it through. Now, I'm going to talk to you about this now. So this radius arm is pre-assembled, and it will go into, on each side here, there's a side with some threads, in this case right here, and a side with no threads. The bolt will go through the side with no threads, and it goes across here and screws into the side with threads on the opposite side. Now, when this bolt is going across here, we call these pinch bolts, this gap here that you can see in the base here, this will pinch this onto the main shaft, which is the main shaft that this rotates around, and where the force of the motor is transferred through gears onto the shaft. So I'm going to go ahead and get some Loctite on these guys here, and we're just going to do a little bit of blue. We only really need it on the tip because that is where the threads that it'll contact are. And again, I'm not tightening these down very much. I'm just kind of keeping the sub-assembly together, but I do want to put the Loctite on there. I do that because I want to know that it's there. I don't want to forget when I go to tighten these down at the end of the build, and assume there's Loctite, or whatever. I don't want to forget to do it, is why I pre-do it now. I can always add a little more Loctite later if I feel the need, although I shouldn't. Loctite, usually if you break it and kind of retighten it, will hold just as well. So again, I want to go through, in this case, the side that tightens. And the way these go is, you'll see that XL Power prints logos in some really handy places. All of those logos are a visual indicator to us as to the right way up, right? Which side is this, right? The opposite side on this doesn't have a logo on it. So I know that I'm holding this upright to you now, that this, so that the logo reads correctly, goes just like this, and the radius arm over here will go across the body here of the main hub. So I take my bolt with the 2 washers on it, I go through these bearings, and then I go through the gap here, and then tighten into the other side. Again, I'm just going to snug this up. I'm not going to tighten this at all. So there's one side, and then we come over and do the other. Get our 2 washers on here. Again, whoops, I literally about to say don't drop these, you'll never find them. This is another reason this silicone build mat will sort of deaden bounces. So you're less likely to lose things, and also there's a nice edge on it so things don't roll off it. Because boy, these little washers are a pain. Okay. Same deal here. XL Power has nicely included a logo, so we know which way is up. And we'll just go ahead and snug this up for now. Again, we'll tighten this when we install this onto the main shaft. Now, speaking of that, so this is one of those instances where I like to assemble a helicopter slightly differently than the way the manual calls for. If I go back 1 page in the manual here, you'll see that they actually want you to go ahead, and this is what we call the Jesus bolt I talked about earlier. And the main shaft will go into the main hub, Jesus bolt will go through it, and they tell you which way is up here. And you would then have this hub sitting on top of the main rotor shaft. Now, the reason I don't do this at this point is the way I like to level my swash plate is because it's just easier to get a swash leveler or zip tie method or whatever you want to do on it without having the main rotor head in the way. So I'll actually install the swash plate on just an empty main shaft, and then finish the entire build that way. I'll do all of my servo setup, servo centering, all that stuff, and then the last thing I'll do is add the main head, and then set up all my pitch and whatnot from there. With that, that's the end of our first episode today. We're going to stop there. Look for more episodes along the way. We'll do these in kind of small bites. I like to sort of work for about 1 to 2 hours, which I figure is about the average amount that most folks do to tackle 1 night's worth of building. And I usually factor in, so a lot of the time you don't see off camera into that estimate. So the time it takes me to unpack all the the parts bags, disassemble things, clean the bolts, all that stuff as well. So with that, that's episode 1 of the Nimbus 550 beginner budget build video series. That's a mouthful. I'm Nick Wisdom, and this is Hack TV. Thanks very much.
Heli direct!